It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind where the coffee pot sputtered slower than usual and the sun cast a warm glow over the quiet cul-de-sac. My house stood at the very end of the street, shaded by a massive old maple tree that had been there long before the first foundation of our neighborhood was ever poured. Its branches stretched wide like a guardian, protecting my porch from the blistering summer sun and carpeting my yard with gold every autumn. To me, it wasn't just a tree. It was a landmark, a living piece of history. But apparently, to the HOA, it was an unsightly nuisance. The first sign of trouble came as a neatly folded paper taped to my front door. In bold black letters at the top, it read, "Violation notice, immediate action required." They claimed the roots were encroaching on community property lines, that the leaves created seasonal debris hazards, and that the trunk itself was a safety concern. They gave me 30 days to remove it or face fines. I stared at that notice for a long time, as if it might suddenly admit it was a prank. After all, the tree wasn't anywhere near the sidewalks. It hadn't damaged a single foundation or cracked a driveway. Stood firm, healthy, and strong. But to the HOA board, it wasn't about safety. It was about control. I knew the type. The board president, a retired real estate agent named Marlene, treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She loved citing obscure rules buried deep in the covenant bylaws. Anything to remind us all that she was in charge. I had seen her measure grass height with a ruler and photograph trash cans left at the curb 2 minutes too long. Now, she had decided my maple tree was next on her hit list. At first, I considered complying just to avoid the hassle. Chainsaw the trunk, grind out the roots, and watch a century of growth vanish into wood chips. But as I sat on my porch that night, watching the sunset filter through the rust-red leaves, I felt something deeper stirring. This wasn't just about a tree. It was about standing up to a petty, power-hungry group who thought they could bully their way through every front yard in the subdivision. The next day, I did my homework. I read through every page of the HOA bylaws, looking for loopholes. I checked city ordinances to confirm that the tree wasn't protected. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Legally, they had the authority to pressure me into removal. I could fight it in court, but the legal fees would crush me faster than the fines. That's when a different idea started forming, one that was equal parts defiance and creativity. If they wanted the tree gone because it looked bad, what if I made it look unforgettable? What if I turned their victory into my masterpiece? I called an old friend who worked as an arborist and wood sculptor. He specialized in transforming dead trees into intricate carvings. Eagles, bears, even entire family crests. I asked him a simple question. If I had to cut down my tree, could we make it into something bold? He laughed and said, "Sure. How bold are we talking?" That's when I told him my plan. Instead of erasing the tree completely, I'd trim it down and leave behind a towering sculpture. Not of an eagle, not of a bear, but of a giant hand flipping the middle finger, facing directly toward the HOA president's house. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it became. They couldn't cite me for debris hazards or roots once the tree was trimmed down. They couldn't fine me for unsightly vegetation, because technically, it wouldn't be a tree anymore. It would be art. And best of all, it would be a message they couldn't ignore. For the next few days, I kept quiet. I nodded politely at the neighbors when they walked past. I pretended to consider my options whenever Marlene stopped by to check if I'd scheduled the removal. Inside, I was already making calls, gathering quotes, and locking in a date. My sculptor friend was ecstatic about the project. He said it would be his most iconic commission to date. The countdown ticked away. 20 days left, then 10. Finally, on a crisp Saturday morning, a truck pulled up with chainsaws, safety harnesses, and a small crane. The crew worked quickly, stripping away the upper branches first, then trimming the trunk down to a thick, sturdy base. Neighbors started gathering along the sidewalk, whispering to each other, curious why I hadn't taken the tree down completely. Even Marlene stood at the edge of her driveway with her arms crossed, phone in hand, clearly documenting every move. By noon, the basic shape had emerged. A thick wrist rising from the stump, the palm angled perfectly, and one long central finger reaching defiantly toward the sky. Some of the neighbors chuckled when they realized what was happening. Others looked horrified, probably worried that Marlene would retaliate against the whole block. But no one stopped me. Not even when Marlene stormed across the street to yell at the workers. My sculptor calmly told her he had all the necessary permits for wood carving, and that no HOA rule prohibited yard art. When the sun began to set, the carving stood complete. 15 feet of polished wood, unmistakable in its message. The giant middle finger caught the orange glow of dusk like a monument to rebellion. That night, I took a picture of it and posted it online with a single caption. HOA told me to cut down my tree, so I did. By morning, it had gone viral. Thousands of likes, shares, and comments poured in. People called it legendary. They called me a hero. Some even offered to start a GoFundMe to cover any fines I might face. But I knew the real storm hadn't hit yet. Marlene wouldn't let this go without a fight. And the HOA had 30 days to issue their final warning. The battle for my tree, or rather my middle finger, was just getting started. By Monday morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. People walking their dogs slowed down to gawk at the towering wooden finger jutting defiantly into the sky. A few stopped to take selfies in front of it, laughing quietly as they hurried away. Cars drove by slower than usual, passengers craning their necks to catch a glimpse. What had once been a quiet street had turned into an accidental tourist stop. But not everyone was amused. At the end of the cul-de-sac, Marlene, the HOA president, stood on her porch with the same expression as someone who had just bitten into a lemon. She watched every passerby with thinly veiled rage, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. By midday, I spotted a group of HOA board members clustered together near her driveway, whispering like generals planning an attack. The first letter arrived that afternoon. Stamped in bold red ink, it accused me of erecting an unsanctioned structure and creating an offensive display visible from common property. The HOA ordered me to restore the area to its original condition or face escalating fines of $500 per day. I knew this was coming. They couldn't touch me over the tree anymore. Technically, I had complied with their demand to remove the hazardous branches and overgrowth. But now they were shifting tactics, calling it a structure instead of a carving. They even attached grainy photos, as if I might somehow deny its existence. What they didn't realize was that by trying to censor me, they were feeding the fire. By now, the post I had made online was spreading far beyond my own circle. People were reposting it on neighborhood drama forums, Twitter, and Reddit threads dedicated to HOA horror stories. Local news stations began reaching out for interviews. By Tuesday, a camera crew was parked in front of my house, filming a segment about the man who fought back against his HOA with art. The neighbors were split. Some cheered me on privately, saying they admired how I stood up to Marlene and her petty rules. Others avoided eye contact altogether, clearly worried about what kind of retaliation might come next. A few even complained that the extra traffic was disturbing their peace. But no one could deny it. The middle finger had become a sensation. On Wednesday evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Normally, only a handful of homeowners ever bothered to attend, but this time the place was packed. I didn't even have to be there to know what was happening. Word spread fast. Marlene was furious, demanding immediate legal action, while a few calmer voices suggested letting it blow over before the whole neighborhood ended up on national television. But Marlene didn't do calm. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. When I stepped outside, I saw workers from the HOA installing a massive privacy screen at the entrance of the cul-de-sac, supposedly to block unsightly views from the main road. The screen was laughable. A flimsy wall of plywood painted beige, already leaning to one side from the wind. But the message was clear. If they couldn't make me take it down, they'd try to hide it from the world. That afternoon, a letter from an HOA lawyer arrived. This one was much more formal, accusing me of violating community standards and threatening to place a lien on my home if I didn't remove the sculpture immediately. They gave me 10 days to comply. It was supposed to intimidate me. Instead, it only strengthened my resolve. I forwarded the letter to a journalist who had already been covering the story. Within hours, The headline appeared online: HOA threatens lien over middle finger tree carving. That article spread even faster than my original post. Comments poured in from people across the country, some offering free legal advice, others offering to help pay any fines, and still others just enjoying the spectacle. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was now a full-blown internet movement. On the 9th day, Marlene herself marched up to my porch with 2 board members in tow. She handed me another notice, this time citing community decency standards, and threatening to have the sculpture forcibly removed by contractors. I didn't argue with her. I didn't even speak. I just smiled because I knew something she didn't. I had already spoken to an attorney of my own. As long as the sculpture was on my property, under the height limit for freestanding structures, and not causing physical danger, the HOA had no legal grounds to tear it down without a court order. And court orders take time they didn't have because the story had now gone fully viral. By the end of that week, a drone video of the sculpture had hit 2 million views on YouTube. News anchors debated whether it was genius or juvenile. A late-night talk show host even joked about it in his opening monologue. People were driving from out of town just to see it in person, snapping photos by the dozens. The HOA was spiraling. Marlene sent out 3 more letters, each more frantic than the last, demanding restoration of neighborhood harmony. Meanwhile, I quietly installed security cameras around my property, knowing full well someone might try to vandalize it out of spite. Then, just as the 10-day deadline expired, I found something new taped to my front door. Not from the HOA, but from the City Code Enforcement Office. Apparently, Marlene had filed a complaint claiming that the sculpture violated local ordinances. If she could get the city involved, she might finally have the leverage she needed. The notice said an inspection would take place the following Monday. I knew the HOA wouldn't give up easily, and I also knew this was about to go beyond just neighborhood politics. The question wasn't whether I could win anymore. The question was how far they'd go to make me lose. The weekend crawled by in a haze of tension. The viral attention had turned my quiet street into something resembling a tourist attraction. Families in minivans slowed down to take pictures. Cyclists paused to admire the defiant wooden finger pointing toward the sky. College kids recorded TikToks in front of my yard, laughing as they posed. But behind the laughter, I felt the pressure mounting. I knew that Monday's inspection from the city wasn't just routine. This wasn't a random check. This was orchestrated by Marlene, the HOA president, who was furious that her threats hadn't worked. She had failed to intimidate me, failed to rally the neighborhood against me, and failed to control the narrative. Now, she was going over my head to people who had real authority. All weekend, I prepared. I printed copies of the local ordinances, highlighting the sections about yard art, structures, and height restrictions. I measured the sculpture twice, making sure it fell safely under the maximum height limit. I even called my lawyer again to confirm that no city code prohibited carvings or offensive shapes, as long as they were on private property. By Monday morning, I was ready. The inspector arrived just after 9. A quiet man in a city vehicle, clipboard in hand, he walked the property line with deliberate steps. Marlene followed a few feet behind him, her arms folded tightly, like a predator stalking prey. 2 other HOA board members trailed after her, their faces stiff with anticipation. They didn't even bother to hide their smirks when the inspector paused at the sculpture, scribbling notes. I watched from my porch as neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other, eager for drama. A few even filmed the scene on their phones, knowing this would end up online by lunchtime. The inspector spent nearly an hour walking around the property, measuring angles and checking clearances. He asked about power lines, drainage, and whether the carving interfered with utility access. Marlene kept interrupting, pointing to imaginary violations, claiming it was a hazard, an eyesore, and offensive to community standards. But the inspector wasn't there to listen to her complaints. He was there to enforce city law. And city law didn't care about hurt feelings. When he finally left, he gave no immediate verdict, just a promise that a written report would be sent to both me and the HOA. Marlene looked confident, as if she'd already won. I could see it in the way she marched back to her house without saying a word. But I had a feeling she would be disappointed. That evening, my lawyer called to reassure me. Unless the city wanted to invent a brand new ordinance on the spot, they had no grounds to force me to remove the sculpture. It wasn't unsafe, it wasn't blocking visibility, and it wasn't violating any zoning rules. At worst, they might ask for minor adjustments like trimming the base for stability. But there was nothing illegal about a carving shaped like a middle finger. The report came in 2 days later. As I expected, the inspector cleared me of any violations. No fines, no orders, nothing. The carving was officially allowed to stay. I thought this would end things. I thought Marlene would finally back off, realizing she'd lost. But I underestimated just how far she would go. The very next morning, I found a fresh letter on my door, this one dripping with desperation. The HOA was calling for a special hearing to review my case. They claimed I was negatively impacting property values and bringing unwanted attention to the community. They also hinted at pursuing civil litigation if I didn't voluntarily remove the sculpture. Meanwhile, the online world was eating it up. News outlets picked up the story again, this time framing it as local HOA defeated by viral tree sculpture. My mailbox filled with letters from strangers, some thanking me for standing up to HOA bullies, others sharing their own stories of harassment. Someone even mailed me a small wooden plaque shaped like a middle finger, as if to commemorate the victory. But with every new headline, Marlene grew more relentless. She patrolled the street like a hawk, snapping photos of visitors and calling the police over traffic disturbances. She went door to door, trying to convince neighbors to sign a petition against me. Some caved out of fear, others simply wanted the chaos to end. One night, just after midnight, I heard footsteps in my yard. I checked my security cameras and saw a figure creeping near the base of the sculpture with what looked like a can of spray paint. Before I could even step outside, the motion-activated lights scared them off. I never got a clear look at their face, but I had my suspicions. That was when I realized this wasn't just about rules or bylaws anymore. This had become personal for both of us. By the end of the week, the HOA sent me another letter, this time announcing that they had hired an attorney specializing in community compliance enforcement. They were preparing to take me to court. I should have been worried. I should have been thinking about legal fees, about the risk of losing my home if things went too far. But all I could think about was how much attention this battle was getting online, and how much the public loved a good underdog story. If Marlene wanted war, I was ready. And if she thought dragging me into court would make me give up, she was about to learn that I could be just as stubborn as she was. The middle finger tree had started as a joke, a small act of rebellion. But now it was becoming a symbol, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been pushed around by an HOA or a petty neighbor with too much power. As I looked out at the carving that evening, glowing orange in the setting sun, I knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. The HOA's decision to take me to court came as no surprise. For weeks, I'd seen it building like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Dark clouds of threats, letters, and whispered warnings gathering strength. By the time the official notice arrived, delivered by certified mail, I almost laughed. Marlene wasn't satisfied with letters, inspections, or emergency meetings. She wanted blood. The notice claimed I had violated community standards, brought public disrepute to the neighborhood, and reduced property values. They were suing for damages and demanding a court order to have the sculpture removed at my expense. It was a last-ditch attempt to crush me under legal fees and intimidation. But I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The viral attention had snowballed into something far bigger than a neighborhood spat. By now, my story had been featured on national television and across countless social media platforms. Strangers from around the country were offering help, legal advice, financial support, even free media coverage. One law firm, known for defending homeowners against overreaching HOAs, reached out and offered to represent me at a steeply discounted rate just for the publicity. The first court date was scheduled for late summer. In the meantime, the sculpture had become a landmark. People were driving hours just to see it, taking pictures and leaving handwritten notes of encouragement on my porch. What Marlene saw as disgraceful, had become an emblem of defiance for thousands of people online. The HOA board grew more desperate by the day. They sent flyers to every house in the neighborhood, accusing me of destroying property values and attracting unwanted attention. Marlene patrolled the street like a warden, glaring at every car that slowed to take a photo. She even called the police multiple times to report suspicious activity near my yard. But every call ended the same way. The officers left shaking their heads, saying no laws were being broken. When the court day finally came, the hearing room was packed. Reporters squeezed into the back rows, and neighbors lined the walls, whispering among themselves. Marlene sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers at her side, flipping through documents with an air of false confidence. I sat at the defense table with my attorney, calm but alert, knowing this was more than just a legal battle. It was a performance. The HOA's argument was simple but weak. They claimed the sculpture was offensive, that it violated vague language in the community bylaws about maintaining neighborhood harmony, and that it had lowered nearby home values. They presented photos of the carving, letters from a handful of neighbors, and even an expert witness, a local realtor who testified that buyers might hesitate to move into a community with such a provocative display. My attorney dismantled their case piece by piece. He pointed out that the HOA covenants didn't actually prohibit sculptures or carvings. He highlighted the fact that no objective property value studies had been done, making their claim speculative. He cited case law protecting expressive displays on private property, even those that some people might find offensive. And, most importantly, he emphasized that I had complied with the original demand to remove hazardous branches. The tree was no longer an overgrown nuisance. The judge listened patiently, asking pointed questions about whether the HOA had any real authority to dictate what shape a tree stump could take. When the hearing ended, he said a written decision would follow within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt endless. Marlene strutted around the neighborhood as if victory were already hers, telling anyone who would listen that the judge would see reason and order the sculpture removed. Meanwhile, my story continued spreading online. People started sending in donations to a legal defense fund, just in case the HOA tried to bankrupt me with appeals. The carving itself became something of a pilgrimage site. Someone even left a bouquet of flowers at its base with a note reading, "Thanks for standing up for all of us." When the decision finally arrived, it was short and clear. The sculpture could stay. The judge ruled that the HOA had failed to prove any legal violation or measurable harm. Their complaints were subjective aesthetic objections, not enforceable restrictions. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it didn't last long. The ruling infuriated Marlene. Instead of accepting defeat, she doubled down. Within days, she called another HOA meeting to discuss raising dues to cover legal expenses. She sent yet another letter threatening to appeal the decision, and she began targeting me in smaller, pettier ways, reporting my trash cans if they stayed at the curb an extra hour, accusing me of improper lawn maintenance, even citing me for leaving Christmas lights up a week too long. It was obvious she wanted to wear me down through sheer harassment. But by now, I had something she didn't: the unwavering support of the public. Every time Marlene tried to push me, the story would flare up again online. News outlets covered each new letter, each new attempt to find me, each new tantrum from the HOA board. And every time, public opinion swung harder in my favor. It wasn't just a neighborhood feud anymore. It was a national symbol of resistance against petty authority. Still, I knew Marlene wasn't done. Her pride wouldn't let her stop until she either forced me out or destroyed the sculpture by any means necessary. And I could see in her eyes that she was thinking about the latter. Late one night, a shadow passed through my yard. The motion sensor lights flashed on, and my cameras caught a blurry figure moving quickly toward the sculpture. This time, they didn't just run off, they tried to climb it, carrying what looked like a crowbar. By the time I ran outside, they were gone, but not before leaving a few fresh gouges in the base. That was when I realized this battle had gone beyond legal papers and courtroom arguments. Marlene, or someone working for her, was ready to take matters into their own hands. And I was going to have to be ready for whatever came next. The court ruling should have ended everything. The judge's decision was final, clear, and impossible to misinterpret. The sculpture was legal. The HOA had no authority to remove it, and I owed them nothing. To most people, that would have been a signal to move on. But to Marlene, it was a declaration of war. Almost immediately after the decision, her petty campaign intensified. She began citing me for the smallest things imaginable. If my lawnmower missed a patch of grass near the curb, I'd get a warning letter. If a visitor's car parked on the street longer than 15 minutes, I'd receive a photo of the license plate with a demand for compliance. It became a game of attrition. If she couldn't beat me in court, she'd try to grind me down until I gave up voluntarily. But I wasn't backing down, and that only seemed to make her angrier. The real escalation came one humid night in early fall. I woke up to the sharp bark of my neighbor's dog and the faint hum of footsteps on the pavement. My security cameras caught a figure in a dark hoodie moving through my yard, heading straight for the sculpture. This time, they weren't just tagging it with spray paint or leaving scratches. They were carrying tools, a crowbar, and something heavier that glinted in the security light. By the time I ran outside, they were gone, leaving deep gouges carved into the base of the sculpture. They tried to chip away at the wrist, as if planning to topple it piece by piece. It wasn't vandalism for fun. It was methodical, deliberate destruction. The next morning, I reported it to the police, and they opened a case for criminal mischief. But without a clear shot of the culprit's face, there wasn't much they could do. I had my suspicions, though. Everyone did. And when the footage leaked online, the internet erupted with outrage. Comments flooded in, accusing Marlene and the HOA of orchestrating the attack. Reporters returned to my street, eager to capture another round of interviews. The story hit national headlines again. HOA feud turns ugly, viral sculpture targeted in midnight attack. The public response was swift and furious. Supporters started showing up outside my house in solidarity, some holding signs, others simply keeping watch through the night to deter another attack. What had started as my private fight had now become a full-fledged movement. People weren't just defending me, they were defending the idea that homeowners shouldn't be bullied by overreaching HOAs. Marlene hated every second of it. Within days, she called yet another emergency HOA meeting, accusing me of inviting dangerous elements into the neighborhood. She claimed the late-night visitors, reporters, and protesters were creating a security risk. She even suggested imposing new fines on me for disrupting community peace. Though everyone knew it was really about punishing me for making her look bad. But the more she fought, the more attention she brought to the story. Donations poured in from people all over the country, not just to help me repair the sculpture, but to install additional security measures. Soon, my yard was ringed with motion lights, high-definition cameras, and even a few volunteer neighbors who offered to keep watch at night. When the HOA attempted to hold a secret vote to remove me from the neighborhood altogether, the backlash was immediate. Word leaked out, and hundreds of strangers flooded their email inboxes with angry messages. Some homeowners in the community, even ones who had stayed neutral before, began openly questioning Marlene's leadership. For the first time, cracks were appearing in her control over the board. But she wasn't finished yet. A week after the attempted vandalism, I woke up to find another letter taped to my door. This one wasn't from the HOA, it was anonymous. No signature, just blocky handwriting that read, "Take it down, or it won't just be the sculpture next time." It was a threat, plain and simple. I took it to the police immediately. They increased patrols in the neighborhood and promised to keep an eye out for suspicious activity. But I could tell they were stretched thin. If Marlene, or whoever was behind this, decided to escalate again, I'd be on my own until help arrived. Meanwhile, the carving itself was starting to show wear. The gouges in the base had weakened the wood, and my arborist friend warned that another serious attack could cause permanent damage. I paid him to reinforce it, adding metal rods through the core and sealing the cracks with resin. If anyone tried to knock it down again, they'd need more than hand tools. All the while, the internet kept cheering me on. People were calling the sculpture a national treasure, a monument to HOA resistance. Someone even designed t-shirts with its silhouette, and all the profits went into a community fund for other homeowners fighting HOA abuse. What Marlene had hoped would humiliate me had made me something of a folk hero. But inside the neighborhood, the tension was unbearable. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel eyes on me. Some neighbors smiled and waved. Others avoided me completely, clearly afraid of taking sides. And Marlene, she didn't even try to hide her hatred anymore. Her glare could have cut through steel. I knew another confrontation was coming. She'd tried legal action. She'd tried intimidation. She'd tried sabotage. And now, with her authority slipping and the board starting to turn against her, she was running out of options. I just didn't realize how far she was willing to go until the night everything came to a head. The aftermath of the tree's transformation rippled far beyond the quiet neighborhood. What had started as a personal act of defiance, a wooden middle finger carved from a beloved oak, had spiraled into something far larger than anyone had imagined. News vans still lingered at the entrance to the subdivision, hoping to catch fresh footage of the infamous sculpture. Strangers drove for miles just to take selfies in front of it. What once was a sleepy cul-de-sac now felt like a roadside attraction, a shrine to stubbornness and creativity wrapped into one. The HOA's rage reached a fever pitch. They had issued fine after fine, each notice thicker than the last, piling up in my mailbox like angry love letters. They claimed the sculpture violated community standards, neighborhood aesthetics, and a laundry list of other rules they seemed to invent on the spot. But my attorney reminded me of something important. Nowhere in the bylaws did it say that a tree carved into art, however rude the art might be, was forbidden. The HOA could huff and puff all they wanted, but legally, they were stuck. Meanwhile, the internet had crowned me a folk hero. Online forums, YouTube channels, and late-night TV shows all featured the story. Memes spread like wildfire. Photoshopped versions of the tree popped up in cities around the world. People called me everything from a genius to a menace, but the overwhelming sentiment was clear. This was a victory for every homeowner who had ever been pushed around by an overzealous HOA. The neighborhood itself was divided. Some residents stopped me in the driveway to shake my hand, grinning as if I had done something truly noble. They whispered their own horror stories of nitpicky violation letters, absurd lawn care mandates, and arbitrary threats from the board. Others, particularly those who sat on the HOA, avoided eye contact altogether. Their faces tightened whenever they drove past the tree, their disapproval practically vibrating through their windshields. The HOA board held emergency meetings. They discussed lawsuits, petitions, and even the possibility of rewriting the bylaws retroactively to ban offensive arboreal structures. But rewriting rules would require a community vote, and thanks to the tree's newfound fame, more residents were paying attention than ever before. Suddenly, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood didn't seem so ironclad. Then came the moment they didn't expect. A local journalist uncovered that several board members had been selectively enforcing rules for years, cracking down on homeowners they disliked while ignoring violations by their friends. The coverage went viral just like the tree had. Now, it wasn't me in the spotlight, it was them. Angry neighbors started showing up at meetings demanding accountability, calling for resignations, and threatening to vote the entire board out. What began as their crusade to cut down one tree had turned into a full-blown neighborhood rebellion. As pressure mounted, the HOA quietly stopped sending fines. Their lawyers stopped leaving voicemail threats. The entire board eventually resigned under public scrutiny, their power eroded by their own pettiness. A new board was elected, one that promised fair treatment, transparency, and an end to micromanaging every flower bed and mailbox paint color. Through it all, the tree stood tall, or rather, tall enough to keep flipping the bird at anyone who dared to look. Its once rough carving had smoothed over time, rain and wind polishing it into something almost elegant. At night, neighbors sometimes left candles or fairy lights at its base, turning it into a strange sort of landmark. It wasn't just my middle finger anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of arbitrary authority. Eventually, the media attention died down, as it always does. New scandals, new stories, new viral sensations replaced mine. But every now and then, I'd catch someone stopping on the sidewalk, phone out, taking one last picture of the most notorious tree in the county. Looking back, it was never really about the tree itself. It was about standing my ground, proving that one homeowner with a bit of creativity could push back against an organization drunk on control. It was about showing that rules should serve the community, not the egos of those in charge. In the end, the HOA lost far more than they ever expected. They lost their positions, their power, and their ability to bully without consequence. And I gained something priceless. Not just a viral moment or a street full of new friends, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable authority is to turn their demands into a monument of defiance. The tree still stands today, weathered but proud, a wooden reminder that even in the neatest, most controlled neighborhoods, a little rebellion can take root, and sometimes it grows into something unforgettable. 5.